You ever feel invisible, like you could just disappear and the world wouldn't even notice? That was Nathaniel Shaw's entire life. By the time he was 14, in the year 1884, there wasn't much left of him. Just a whisper of a boy, made of little more than bone, dust, and a quiet so heavy it felt like it could sink through the floorboards. He was an orphan, a piece of driftwood left behind by a cholera-swept wagon train 2 years back. The tiny, hard-bitten settlement of Providence, Wyoming, had taken him in, but not out of kindness. No, they took him in the way a stray dog picks up fleas. He was just another mouth to feed, another pair of hands for the jobs no one else wanted, and a walking, breathing reminder of how fragile life was out on those vast, empty plains. His world was a never-ending circle of thankless work and cold shoulders. He'd muck out the stables for a blacksmith named Vance, a man whose face was perpetually soured, like he'd been sucking on a lemon his whole life. He'd sweep the floors of the general store for a woman who paid him in stale biscuits, counting each one as if it were a gold coin. He slept in a lean-to behind the saloon, a shack so rotten that the wind whistled through the walls, singing a constant, lonely funeral song just for him. He had no memory of his mother's face. All he had of his father was a ghost of an image, of calloused hands and a tired sigh. Loneliness wasn't a feeling for Nathaniel. It was the weather. It was the air he breathed. It was the sky above and the dirt below. On Sundays, he'd watch the families walk to the little clapboard church, all holding hands, and a pain would shoot through him, sharp and familiar, like an old war wound aching in the cold. The folks in Providence weren't mean on purpose. They were just hard. Their lives were a bare-knuckle brawl with drought, dust, and despair. They didn't have any room left over for softness, especially not for a boy who didn't belong to anyone. They saw his downcast eyes and the permanent hunch in his shoulders, and they wrote him off. Weak. Another soul the prairie would probably swallow whole. They didn't see the steel wire coiled inside his skinny frame, the quiet grit that let him soak up all their casual cruelty, and the echoing emptiness of his life without shattering into a million pieces. Nathaniel had learned a hard lesson early on. Survival wasn't about being strong. It was about being small. It was about making yourself so unnoticeable that the world might just forget to step on you. That autumn, the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the only thing anyone in Providence talked about was the buffalo. The great southern herd was on the move, a dark, thundering river of life that promised meat for the coming winter and hides to trade for things they couldn't grow or make. A hunting party of the town's toughest men rode out, kicking up a cloud of dust and loud, bragging confidence. Nathaniel, of course, was left behind. His job was to haul water and turn over the dirt in a garden that was already giving up, surrendering to the first whispers of frost. He was about a mile from the settlement, down by the cottonwood trees that lined a shallow, winding creek, when he felt it. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a tremor, a deep, humming vibration that came up through the worn-out soles of his boots and resonated in the hollow of his chest. It felt like the whole world was humming a single, ominous note. He straightened up, the water in his bucket sloshing over the rims, and he scanned the horizon. To the south, the endless prairie met the sky in a perfectly straight line, or it had been. Now the line wasn't clean anymore. A darkness was spreading across it, like a smudge of soot on a painting. It grew and churned, and then he saw it was a rolling cloud of dust, bigger than anything he'd ever seen. And then the sound hit him, a low rumble that grew and grew until it was a deafening roar, like 1,000 thunderstorms all breaking at the exact same second. The buffalo. It wasn't some small offshoot for a hunting party. It was the whole herd, the whole magnificent, terrifying, living avalanche. And it was stampeding, right towards the creek, right towards him. A cold, absolute terror seized him by the throat. He dropped the buckets and he ran. His heart was a wild drum beating against his ribs, trying to break free. But he wasn't running back toward the settlement. He didn't know why, but his feet carried him along the creek, toward a shallow ravine he knew, a small scar in the earth that might offer some shelter. As he scrambled over a small rise, his breath tearing at his lungs, he saw he wasn't alone. A small party of Cheyenne were caught just as off guard as he was. They had been watering their horses. Now they were in a panic. Warriors leaping onto their ponies, their faces grim, racing to get out of the path of that living earthquake. But one of them wasn't moving. An old man. His face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles and wisdom, and his hair was as white as the first snow of winter. He had stumbled. His leg was twisted beneath him at an unnatural angle. He lay on the ground, his expression not of terror, but of a strange, serene calm, as if he were just watching the sunset. He was watching death thunder towards him, and in that second, the world just narrowed for Nathaniel. The roar of the hooves, the panicked shouts of the warriors, the frantic, terrified drumming of his own heart, it all faded away into a dull, distant hum. All he saw was the old man, alone, vulnerable, waiting to be erased. And something inside of Nathaniel, a part of him he never even knew existed, a part that had been locked away in a cage of fear and silence, just broke free. It was an instinct, something deeper and more powerful than the need to save his own skin. It was a sudden, blinding, absolute refusal to stand by and watch another person be swallowed up by the uncaring world. He had been invisible his entire life, a ghost that nobody saw. Now, in the face of 1,000 tons of charging death, he decided to be a shield. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the odds. He just acted. He stopped running away from the danger, and he turned and ran straight into its deafening, thundering heart. He reached the fallen elder just as the first wave of bison was on them, a solid wall of shaggy muscle, wild eyes, and gleaming horns. Without a second's hesitation, he threw his own small, bony body over the old man's, curling himself into a tight ball, his arms wrapped around his head. He squeezed his eyes shut and braced for the end. The first hoof hit his back like a blacksmith's hammer. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a silent scream. Pain, white hot and blinding, exploded behind his eyes. Then another blow, and another, and another. It wasn't a series of impacts anymore. It was a single, continuous, crushing weight. The ground shook with a violence that rattled his teeth in his skull. The air was thick and choked with the smell of dust and sweat and the raw, primal fear of the animals. He felt one of his ribs snap, a sharp, searing agony that lanced through his side. The world was nothing but noise and pressure, and a pain so immense, so all-consuming, that it stopped being a feeling and became its own universe. He was just a passenger in a body being systematically destroyed. He clung to consciousness by the thinnest of threads, his mind repeating a single desperate mantra of pure grit. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Then a final devastating blow to the back of his head sent him spiraling down into a silent, starless black. The river of buffalo thundered on, a force of nature that had no knowledge of the small act of courage it was currently crushing into the dirt. And for Nathaniel Shaw, the world finally went away. He didn't wake up so much as drift back into existence. Consciousness wasn't a switch being flipped. It was a slow, agonizing tide seeping back onto a barren shore. The first thing he knew was the pain. It was a dull, throbbing, universe-sized ache that seemed to fill his entire being. He was the epicenter of a world made of pure hurt. Then came sounds, muffled and strange. The soft rustle of hide, the gentle crackle of a fire, and a low rhythmic chanting. It was a language he'd never heard, but it felt ancient, like the earth itself had been given a voice. He tried to open his eyes. His eyelids were heavy, swollen things that refused to listen to him. He was lying on something soft, a bed of furs that smelled of wood smoke and sage. The air was warm, a world away from the biting wind that always found its way through the cracks of his lean-to. A hand touched his forehead. It was gentle, cool, and dry. Then a different sensation, a wet cloth dabbing at his split lip. The taste of herbs and cool water, a balm on his parched, cracked tongue. He managed to let out a groan, a sound that felt like it was torn from the very depths of his savage body. Slowly, fighting his way through the thick, gray fog of pain, he forced his eyes open. At first, everything was a blur of firelight and shadow. Then slowly, shapes began to resolve themselves. He was inside a lodge, a teepee, The conical walls of hide created a warm circular space. A small fire burned in the center, and its smoke drifted lazily up to an opening at the very peak. And sitting around him, in a silent, watchful circle, were 7 figures. They were young men, their faces half hidden in the flickering shadows, their expressions completely unreadable. They had the high cheekbones and strong jawlines of the Cheyenne, their black hair long and braided. They wore simple buckskin leggings and shirts, and their stillness, their absolute silence, was more intimidating than any weapon could ever be. These were not the loud, scornful men from Providence. These men seemed like they had been carved from the plains themselves, their silence as vast and deep as the sky. Fear, that cold, familiar old friend, tried to rise in Nathaniel's throat, but it was too weak. The pain was too strong, too overwhelming for any other emotion to compete. He tried to push himself up, but a fresh wave of agony shot through his back and chest like a bolt of lightning. He fell back with a gasp, his vision swimming in a dizzying swirl of black spots. One of the figures, the one who seemed to be the oldest, his face stern and radiating authority, made a small, sharp gesture with his hand. Another man, whose hands were stained with what looked like dried herbs and earth, leaned forward. He spoke, his voice low and guttural, not to Nathaniel, but to the others. The words were meaningless to the boy, but the tone was one of sober, clinical assessment. This was Woka, the healer. His touch was both practiced and gentle as he began to examine the boy's wounds, his hands moving with a skill that somehow avoided causing more pain than was absolutely necessary. Nathaniel lay there, a broken thing on a bed of furs, surrounded by 7 silent warriors, with no idea if he was a patient or a prisoner. He had no idea if he had woken up from one nightmare only to find himself in the middle of a much, much worse one. The days started to bleed into one another. His life became a hazy, shifting continuum of pain, sleep, and brief, lucid moments of quiet observation. His entire world shrank to the size of that buffalo hide bed and the circle of 7 faces that constantly surrounded it. He started to learn them, not by name but by their presence, their aura. There was the leader, Moavato. His gaze was heavy, weighted down with responsibility and a deep, unyielding gravity. He rarely spoke, but when he did, the other 6 listened with an absolute, unwavering attention. There was a watcher, Hanya Haka. His eyes missed nothing. His face was a perfect mask of intense, quiet scrutiny. He would sit for hours on end, just observing Nathaniel, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the flicker of his eyelids, as if he were trying to read the story written in the boy's suffering. Woka, the healer, was a constant presence. He tended to Nathaniel's injuries with a skill that was beyond anything the boy could have imagined. He would grind herbs into thick pastes that soothed the burning fire of his abrasions. He brewed teas from roots and leaves that dulled the sharp, jagged edges of his pain. He never smiled. His face was a permanent mask of concentration, but his hands were unbelievably kind. Then there were the others. Akiseto, broad-shouldered and powerful, a man who seemed to carry the strength of the very bulls that had nearly killed the boy. Hotoa, who was leaner, more restless. He often paced the tight confines of the lodge like a caged wolf, his energy a stark contrast to the stillness of the others. There was Tabihan, whose face was more open, less guarded than the rest. You could almost feel the curiosity coming off him in waves. And finally there was Kana, the youngest. He couldn't have been much older than Nathaniel himself. It was Kana who finally broke through the wall of silent, methodical duty. One afternoon when the pain had subsided to a low, manageable thrum, Kana approached his bedside alone. The others were outside, their voices a low murmur in the distance. He held out a small object in the palm of his hand. It was a piece of cottonwood, smoothed and polished by patient hands, carved into the shape of a hawk, its wings outstretched in flight. He placed it gently in Nathaniel's hand, his fingers briefly brushing against the boy's. Then he said a single word. "Say so." His voice was soft. He pointed to the carving, and then he pointed up to the patch of blue sky visible through the smoke hole at the top of the lodge. Nathaniel understood. Hawk. It was the first word. the first bridge across the vast silent chasm that separated their two worlds. He curled his weak fingers around the small gift. The smooth wood was a tiny point of warmth in the vast cold sea of his pain and confusion. He gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. A flicker of something, not quite a smile, but something close, crossed Kana's face before he quietly retreated back to his place in the circle. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was the first sign that he wasn't just an object, a piece of broken cargo they were tending to. He was a person. He started to piece things together. The 7 men were grandsons. He figured this out by watching their interactions with the elder. Voken, the old man from the stampede. He now lay on his own bed of furs across the lodge, his injured leg bound tightly in a splint. His eyes, unlike his body, were clear and sharp. He would watch Nathaniel for long stretches of time, his gaze filled with a complex, swirling mixture of gratitude, pity, and a profound, bottomless curiosity. It was for him, Nathaniel now understood. That's why he had run into the path of death. And it was his grandsons who now stood this silent, imposing vigil over the boy who had saved him. Their care was methodical, efficient, born of a duty he still couldn't quite comprehend. They brought him broth, spooning it carefully past his cracked lips. They kept the fire stoked day and night, making sure the warmth never left the lodge. They changed the poultices on his back and chest, where the bruises had blossomed into a horrific, ugly tapestry of black, blue, and sickening yellow-purple. And they did all of this with a stoic, detached professionalism that was both comforting and deeply unnerving. He was a charge, a responsibility, but he was not one of them. He was the white boy, the outsider, a living, breathing puzzle they had been tasked with keeping alive. The strange thing was, the raw, spitting hatred he had always heard about in Providence, the stories of savage Indians, it was completely absent. In its place was this solemn, watchful gravity, a weight of expectation that he could feel pressing down on him, even if he couldn't put a name to it. Why? Why were they doing all this for a stranger, an outsider, a boy from the world that was slowly, relentlessly destroying their own? The question echoed in the silent spaces between the crackling of the fire and the low chanting of the healer. And Nathaniel had no answer. Weeks crawled by. The raw, screaming agony in Nathaniel's body finally began to subside, settling into a deep, persistent ache that lived in his bones. He could sit up now, propped against a clever backrest of willow and hide that Woka had fashioned for him. He spent his days watching the life of the camp through the open flap of the lodge. It was like looking into another world. He saw women tanning hides, their hands moving with a practiced, fluid grace that was mesmerizing. He saw children playing games with stones and sticks, their laughter a sound that was both alien and achingly beautiful. He saw warriors returning from a hunt, their posture proud and assured, carrying themselves with a confidence he had never known. It was a world that was complete, whole, and perfectly self-contained. A world that had no place for him, and yet here he was, sitting right in the very heart of it. He finally learned their names as he heard the elder, Voken, speak them. He matched the names to the faces he had studied for weeks. Moavato, the solemn, powerful leader. Hanyahaka, the keen-eyed, silent observer. Woka, the quiet, gentle healer. Akiseto, the strong one, the bull. Hotoa, the restless hunter with fire in his eyes. Tabihan, the sun shield with his open, curious face. And Kana, the swift young one, the boy who had shown him the first glimmer of human kindness. They were 7 distinct parts of a single, unified whole, bound to each other and to their grandfather by a loyalty as strong and unyielding as the land itself. The turning point, the moment everything changed, came on a day when the autumn air had turned sharp and crisp, with the first real promise of winter. Voken was finally strong enough to sit up and speak at length. He called his grandsons to him, and they gathered around his bed, their attention absolute, their reverence for the old man a palpable force in the lodge. Then he gestured for Nathaniel to be brought closer. Akiseto and Tavihan lifted him, furs and all, with a surprising gentleness, and placed him so that he was part of the circle. The old man began to speak. His voice was weak, but it was clear. and it resonated with the authority of a lifetime of leadership. He spoke in the Cheyenne tongue, a language of soft consonants and flowing vowels, but his eyes, sharp and bright, were fixed on Nathaniel. He used his hands as he spoke, painting pictures in the air. He told the story of the hunt, of the rumbling earth, of the pure, mind-numbing terror of the stampede. He described his fall, the brittle snap of his own bone, the cold, calm certainty of his own death as he looked into the face of that charging, unstoppable herd. His grandsons listened, their faces carved from stone, but a new subtle tension began to fill the lodge. Then Voken's gaze softened, and he pointed a long, wrinkled finger directly at Nathaniel. He spoke of how the boy, a stranger, a child of the very people who were encroaching on their lands, stealing their future, had not run away. He described, his voice filled with a quiet wonder, how Nathaniel had run toward him, not away. How the boy's small, frail body had covered his own, becoming a living, breathing shield against the thunder. He spoke of the sickening impacts, the sound of the boy's own bones breaking, of a selfless, insane courage that defied all logic and reason. As the old man spoke, the atmosphere in the lodge began to shift. It was like watching ice melt in the spring sun. The wall of stoic, detached observation that the seven brothers had maintained around Nathaniel began to crumble, and it was replaced by something else entirely, something that looked a lot like awe. For the very first time, Nathaniel saw raw, unfiltered emotion crack their stoic facades. He saw it in the widening of Hanyahaka's ever-watchful eyes. He saw it in the way Moavato's jaw tightened, not with suspicion anymore, but with a profound, troubled respect. He saw Awoke, the healer, look at the boy's healing wounds not just as a medical challenge, but as a living testament to the incredible story his grandfather was telling. When the old man finally finished, a heavy, profound silence descended upon the lodge. It was no longer the silence of suspicion or curiosity. It was the silence of deep, collective contemplation. These seven warriors were reevaluating everything they thought they knew about the world, about their enemies, about the strange, broken white boy lying in their midst. Voken looked at each of his grandsons in turn, his gaze lingering on them, before turning back to Nathaniel. He spoke again, his voice softer now, asking a question. Moavato was the first one to move. He rose to his feet, a towering figure in the firelight, and came to Nathaniel's side. He looked down at the boy, and for the first time, Nathaniel didn't feel like an object of scrutiny. He felt like a person who was truly being seen. Moavato spoke, his voice a low, deep rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together. "He says," a new voice translated, startling Nathaniel. It was Hanyahaka, the watcher. His English was halting, heavily accented, but it was clear. "He says, my grandfather, that your spirit is stronger than your bones." Moavato nodded, his eyes locked on Nathaniel's. "He says," Hanyahaka continued, his own voice now tinged with a strange new respect, "you have the heart of a warrior." Nathaniel could only stare, completely overwhelmed. He had never been called anything but a burden, a stray, a waste of space. To be called a warrior by these men in this place, it was a thing so far beyond his comprehension that it left him utterly speechless. The ice hadn't just been broken, it had been shattered. From that day forward, the entire nature of his existence changed. The brothers no longer just cared for him out of a sense of duty. They began to connect with him. Hanyahaka became his translator, his patient teacher. He would point to objects and give him the Cheyenne words: Hoesta, fire; Mapa, water; Netseo, family. Woka, while tending to his wounds, would now explain the properties of the herbs he was using, showing him the willow bark that eased the pain and the yarrow that stopped the bleeding. Akiseto and Hotoa, the mighty hunters, would recount stories of their adventures, their gestures vivid and expressive, making him see the cunning of the wolf and the raw power of the bear. Tavihan, with his more open, gentle nature, would just sit and talk with him, asking about the world of the white man with a genuine, non-judgmental curiosity that Nathaniel had never encountered before. And Cana, his first friend, continued to be his quiet companion, bringing him small gifts, a hawk feather, a polished river stone, a strip of sweet, dried berry jerky. Slowly, cautiously, Nathaniel began to emerge from his own shell of silence. At first his voice was rusty and weak from disuse. He told them his name. He spoke of his own past, not as a plea for pity, but as a simple, unvarnished statement of fact. He had no parents. He had no family. He had no home. He spoke of the crushing loneliness of Providence, the coldness of the people, the soul-crushing feeling of being completely and utterly invisible. And as he spoke, he saw something incredible in their eyes. It wasn't pity, it was understanding. They, who were defined by their kinship, their intricate web of relations and responsibilities, they seemed to understand the profound, abject poverty of a life without it. His body continued to heal. The broken ribs knitted themselves back together, leaving a permanent, deep ache that flared up with the cold. The horrific bruises faded to yellowing shadows and then finally disappeared. He learned to walk again. His first halting, painful steps were supported by the strong, steady arms of Moavato and Akasero. He had a limp, and Woka told him he always would. A permanent reminder, etched into his very gait, of the day the earth shook and the world tried to crush him. They gave him soft, buckskin clothing to replace the tattered rags he had arrived in, clothes that felt warm and alive against his skin. He was no longer just an outsider being cared for. He was becoming a part of the rhythm of their lives. He was Nathaniel, the boy who had shielded their grandfather. He was no longer invisible. Here in this lodge, surrounded by these 7 brothers and their wise elder, he was seen. He was known. And for the first time in his entire lonely life, the hollow space inside his chest began to fill with something other than loneliness. It was a strange, tentative warmth he didn't dare put a name to, but it felt, he thought, a lot like belonging, and he prayed it would never end. But the peace he had found was fragile. He knew it. It was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold, rushing river. He tried to push that knowledge away, tried to live only in the warmth of the present moment. But the threat, when it finally came, didn't arrive as a whisper on the wind. It arrived as a hard, arrogant voice that shattered the morning calm like a rock through a pane of glass. It was a cold, bright day. The sun glinted off a light frost that had silvered every blade of prairie grass. Nathaniel was sitting just outside the lodge, mending a fishing net with a bone needle, a task Hotoa had been patiently teaching him. He moved with a new confidence. His body, though still marked by a persistent ache, had regained much of its strength. He wore the buckskins and moccasins they had given him, and his pale straw-colored hair was a stark contrast to the dark braids of the Cheyenne children he now played with. He heard the horses first, the heavy shod tread of American mounts, a sound so different from the light-footed, unshod ponies of the Cheyenne. A knot of ice instantly formed in the pit of his stomach. He looked up, his heart beginning to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against his newly healed ribs. A group of riders was cresting the small hill that overlooked the camp. There were a dozen of them, all armed with rifles, their faces grim and set with a hard, ugly purpose. And at their head, sitting on a big, mean-looking stallion, was Garrett Vance, the blacksmith from Providence, the man whose cruelty was as hard and unyielding as the iron he hammered day in and day out. Vance's eyes swept across the camp, his expression a foul mixture of contempt and greed. Then his gaze landed on Nathaniel. The boy's heart hammered. He saw the shock on Vance's face first, quickly followed by a dark, possessive fury. "There he is!" Vance bellowed, his voice carrying across the quiet camp, a violation of the morning peace. "The savages took him, just like I said." Instantly, the camp came alive, but there was no panic. The Cheyenne warriors moved with a fluid, disciplined grace that was terrifying to behold. They emerged from their lodges, their expressions stern, their hands empty, but their weapons were only a heartbeat away. Within seconds, the 7 brothers were there. They formed a silent, unbroken line in front of Voken's lodge, where the elder now stood, leaning on a tall staff. And they placed Nathaniel behind them, shielding him with their bodies, a perfect, living echo of how he had shielded their grandfather. Moavato stood at the very center of the line, his arms crossed over his powerful chest. He was the picture of calm, immovable authority, his presence a bulwark against the intrusion. "We ain't here for a fight," Vance shouted, though his men all held their rifles at the ready, their knuckles white. "We're here for the boy. Hand him over, and we'll be on our way." Hanya stepped forward slightly, resuming his role as translator. He spoke to Moavato in Cheyenne, his voice low and rapid, then turned his cold, flat gaze back to Vance. "He is not a prisoner," Hanya said, his English measured and precise, each word a carefully placed stone. "He is a guest. He is healing." "Healing?" Vance let out a harsh, ugly laugh that scraped the clean morning air. "Looks to me like he's gone native. Look at him, dressed in heathen rags. They've twisted his mind." He spurred his horse forward a few steps, his eyes locking on Nathaniel, who peeked out from behind Akasito's broad shoulder. "Boy, Nathaniel, you come with us now. We're here to save you." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. Save him? These men. The men who had looked straight through him his entire life. The men who had treated him as less than dirt. They were now claiming to be his saviors. They wanted to drag him back to that cold, rotten lean-to, back to the loneliness, back to being invisible. They wanted to rip him away from the only place he had ever felt warmth, the only people who had ever shown him a shred of true kindness. Fear warred with a new, unfamiliar feeling inside him. Anger, a hot, righteous anger that burned away the last vestiges of the timid, frightened boy he had once been. He saw the situation for exactly what it was. This wasn't a rescue. It was an invasion, an assertion of power by men who believed their world was the only one that mattered, and anyone outside of it was less than human. And in that moment, he made his choice. He stepped out from behind the living shield of the brothers. His limp was more pronounced under the stress, but his shoulders were straight and his chin was high. He stood beside Moavato, a pale, slender sapling next to a great, ancient oak. And yet, he did not waver. "I'm not going with you," Nathaniel said. His voice was clearer and stronger than he had ever heard it. Vance's face, already flushed, began to purple with rage. "What did you say, boy? Have they threatened you? Don't you worry. We'll handle these red-skinned devils." "They are not devils," Nathaniel shot back, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "They saved my life." He took a deep, steadying breath, his eyes scanning the faces of the posse, men he had known his whole life, men who had never once truly seen him. He saw their confusion, their ingrained prejudice warring with the undeniable sight of the boy standing freely, defiantly before them. He looked directly at Vance, his eyes narrowing. "I saw you that day," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping, becoming quiet and sharp as a shard of ice. "The day of the stampede. You were there, by the creek. You saw the elder fall." He let the words hang in the cold air, each one a hammer blow. "You were the first to run." A wave of murmurs rippled through the posse. Vance's face went from purple to a mottled, sickly white. He had built his reputation in Providence on being a tough, fearless man. To be called a coward, a liar, by an orphan boy in front of everyone. It was a blow to his pride he could not withstand. "You lie!" Vance snarled, his hand tightening on his rifle, his knuckles turning white. He started to raise it. "You ungrateful whelp, I'll—" He never finished the sentence. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Moavato, Hanya, Woka, and all 7 brothers took one single unified step forward. They didn't draw their weapons. They didn't shout a war cry. They simply moved as one, a silent, implacable wall of deadly intent. Their message was terrifyingly, brutally clear. You will not touch him. The men behind Vance shifted uneasily on their horses. This wasn't what they signed up for. They had come for a simple retrieval, a show of force against a people they considered weak. They had not come to face 7 hardened warriors defending one of their own, which impossibly the little white orphan boy now seemed to be. They had not come to die for Garrett Vance's bruised pride. They saw the undeniable truth in Nathaniel's words, and the raw, panicked shame on Vance's face. One by one, the men lowered their rifles. One of them, a farmer named Amos, finally spoke up, his voice nervous. "Garrett, maybe we should just go. The boy seems fine." Vance looked from the defiant, accusing face of Nathaniel to the stone-cold eyes of the seven brothers, and he saw his authority, his reputation, everything he had built, crumble into dust. Defeated, his face a twisted mask of pure, impotent hatred, he wrenched his horse's reins, turning it so violently the animal reared up in protest. Without another word, he galloped away, his posse trailing shamefully behind him, a disorganized and dishonored retreat. Nathaniel stood his ground, watching them go. He watched until the dust of their departure settled back onto the quiet prairie, until they were nothing but a tiny, insignificant speck on the horizon. The tension slowly drained out of him, leaving him trembling, not with fear, but with the adrenaline-fueled aftermath of a battle he had never imagined he would fight, let alone win. He felt a heavy hand land gently on his shoulder. It was Moavato. The stern warrior looked down at him, and in his dark, deep-set eyes, Nathaniel saw something profound. It was approval. It was pride. It was acceptance. The camp slowly, cautiously returned to its morning rhythm. But something fundamental, something seismic, had changed. The confrontation had solidified what had been quietly growing for months. Nathaniel had not just been saved by the Cheyenne. He had chosen them. He had defended them. In front of his old world, he had stood with his new one. He had stood with them as family. That evening, as the first stars began to glitter in the vast, ink-black sky, Vulcan called for him again. The seven grandsons were there, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the hide walls of the lodge. The air was thick with a sense of ceremony, a quiet, sacred importance. The old man looked at Nathaniel, his ancient eyes filled with a deep, bottomless wisdom. He spoke, and Hanyahaka translated, his own voice soft and reverent now. "My grandfather says that an act of courage creates a debt. Your act," he said, looking at Nathaniel, "saved his body. Our care for you has paid that debt." Hanyahaka paused, his voice wavering with a hint of emotion he couldn't hide. "But today you did something more. You defended our honor. You spoke truth against a lie. You stood with us as one of our own. This creates not a debt, but a bond of the spirit." Vulcan nodded slowly. He held up his hand, and one by one his grandsons stepped forward. Moavato came first. He stood before Nathaniel and placed a hand on the boy's right shoulder, the weight of it both comforting and real. "I am Moavato," he said, speaking the English words himself, slow and deliberate. "You are my brother now. I will be your shield." Then came Hanyahaka. He placed his hand on Nathaniel's left shoulder. "I am Hanyahaka. You are my brother. I will be your eyes." Woka followed, his healer's hand gentle on Nathaniel's arm. "I am Woka. You are my brother. I will be your healer." One by one they came, each placing a hand on him, forming a living chain of connection, a physical embrace of bone and muscle and loyalty. "I am Aki Sato. You are my brother. I will be your strength. I am Hotoa. You are my brother. I will be your hunter. I am Tavihan. You are my brother. I will be your shelter." Finally, young Kana stepped up, his face glowing with an earnest, heartfelt devotion. He placed his hand directly over Nathaniel's heart. "I am Kana. You are my brother. I will be your friend." 7 hands rested upon him. 7 solemn vows spoken into the sacred quiet of the lodge. 7 brothers. His brothers. Nathaniel stood in their midst, tears streaming freely down his face for the first time since he had been left alone in the world. They were not tears of sorrow or pain. They were tears of a joy so profound, so overwhelming, it felt as if his heart, which had been a small, cold stone for so long, had finally miraculously burst into flame. The orphan boy who was trampled and left for dead had awakened to a life of pain and uncertainty. But he had healed, and in healing he had found something far more precious than his own survival. He was no longer Nathaniel Shaw, the stray scrap from Providence. He was brother to 7 warriors. He was the grandson of a wise elder. He was part of a family forged not by blood, but by courage, by honor, and by a love as vast and enduring as the land itself. He was, at long last, home. If you found this story of courage and family as incredible as I did, Do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got so many more stories like this to share, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thanks for watching.